honoured to be speaking to Carolyn Clarke today from Brave Consultancy. Carolyn is a member of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors Council, an NED and an internal auditor, and she's been an internal auditor for many years. Today, I'm particularly keen to hear Carolyn's views from the NED perspective. The Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors and Protiviti are collaborating on a project exploring both organisations and internal auditors' reactions to a disruption scenario. Carolyn, we have spoken previously, and you also attended one of our disruption roundtables. I'm looking forward to hearing about what you have seen regarding innovative approach to the recent pandemic, one of the most significant global disruption scenarios for some time. So my first question to you is, what were the immediate challenges from the pandemic that you observed?
So the immediate challenges that I observed when the pandemic started were very similar to those that everyone will have experienced with regards to the need for individuals to simply work remotely and to work from home. From a risk and audit perspective, this is something that is entirely new to us and created challenges in areas such as technology and relationships with our key stakeholders. It meant that we had to respond really quickly to try and determine what was most critical at that point in time and how we continued to focus on those items that were most critical and create the forum for having open and transparent discussion at a time that was very challenging. As a board, we had to think about how to really enable views to be heard, views from the board as a whole, views from frontline operational leaders, and views from our audit and assurance functions. And this meant finding different ways to organise meetings, moving perhaps from having back-to-back meetings to having them over a period of time to allow actions to arise in between times. Inevitably, though, it took a lot of time. And I think one of the things that has really emerged from the pandemic has been much more frequent engagement, much more real-time engagement over a number of issues. So there clearly have been benefits as well as challenges. So the organisations I am involved with each worked quite differently in developing their responses. It really has to come down to the way in which the leadership team work together, and as an NED, the interaction between the board and the leadership team. In each case, though, we had to determine the right way to communicate and to engage between ourselves. We had to think through the priorities. And in particular, it became clear that we really needed to focus on the basics. And again, I think this is a learning that has come from this process. It's become increasingly apparent that ensuring that basic controls around finance, around data protection, around security, physical and cyber security, have got to be maintained even in the context of disruption. And it made us really go back to the question of what's most important. At the same time, of course, we had to have a strategic response. We had to think about where we could be agile. We had to think about where our single points of failure were. And we had to align our priorities and efforts in order to ensure that we could be as resilient as possible. I think overall we'll see the word resilience becoming much more common going forwards. So with regards to innovation, I think the thing that was most apparent in considering particularly our audit functions was the opportunity that data and data analytics created. Many audit functions have been thinking some time about how to really use data analytics, but it perhaps takes a bit of a crisis such as this for us to really realise the opportunity it creates at a time when face-to-face meetings are much more limited. And one can't simply wander around the shop floor or the factory and obtain information in that way. In order to get robust information, data analytics offers a whole world of new opportunities. And I think we all saw that being focused on more specifically. I also think that teams that were already considering agile approaches, hubs, much more frequent discussion of issues, more flexibility in reporting, were able to adapt more quickly. Compared to those teams that perhaps have a more rigid approach. So I think what we learned about innovation is that it's perhaps not big new ideas, but it's staying at the forefront of using data, thinking about culture, thinking about agility. Of course, there are teams out there that have done things that are much more imaginative, that are using drones and videoing techniques. And I think we'll see a lot more development in that space going forwards. But in the immediate aftermath of a disruptive event, you have to build on the tools that you have at hand. And I think we saw data and analytics in particular come into their own. So I think there were both surprises and challenges, and in that I mean both positive and perhaps more difficult situations. In some ways it's not a surprise, but I think we've all been impressed by our teams and our people and their ability to adapt and to be resilient and to work in different ways and to find solutions in difficult circumstances. And over time, their ability to maintain that, because I don't think any of us expected that more than a year on from the start of the pandemic, we would still be having to deal with those issues. So it's been real positive learning. I also think we found that in some ways we can develop better relationships in this environment because we're more accessible, we're more available, we're spending less time traveling, and we can have more conversations, and sometimes better conversations because they're happening real time, not on a schedule with formal meetings and meeting rooms dictating when we can or cannot meet. So I think that there has been lots of positive to come out of it in that sense. From a challenges perspective, I'm sure we've all learnt areas of our organisation that are not as well controlled or organised as we would like them to be. We found the gaps, we found the issues that may well not have come to the surface as immediately as they have. And so we've got some real work to remediate and to make sure that those gaps in our control frameworks and those risks that we were not so aware of are better managed and mitigated going forwards. We need to look at our supply chain, for example, and ensure that that is fully resilient, regardless of the nature of the disruption or shock that might happen. We need to make sure that our people and teams can work with technology that is secure and safe, regardless of the environment. So there are many areas where we need to be thinking about the resilience of our underlying systems, tools, structures and processes, because we can guarantee that there will be disruption of one form or another going forwards. What I think I've learned from the pandemic is to have confidence in my views and perspectives as an auditor, as a audit committee chair, and as somebody who is responsible for helping organisations to really think through their risks and particularly they're emerging risks. We've learned that risks do materialise, and we've learned that what we might think is severe but plausible, to use the language of a viability statement, can actually happen. And actually, the outcomes of risk materialising are similar regardless of the underlying cause. They impact on our customers, they impact on our supply chain, they impact on our employees, on our systems, our infrastructure, and all of the aspects of our operations. And as internal auditors and non-executives, we need to have the confidence to challenge and the confidence to ask the difficult questions, to make sure that the right responses are available to us when we need them, so that we can stay ahead of the game. We can all see that there are companies that have survived and even thrived through the pandemic because they had the ability to be agile. They had the culture that enabled them to look for the solutions. And there are those companies that have struggled more. And I think going forwards, a real focus on organisational resilience and how that aligns with the strategic objectives and broader purpose of the organisation will be critical. I think the other piece that we've learned is that the world is a very connected place, and I really hope that it will accelerate our focus on climate and the environment and broader societal purpose as critical objectives alongside financial gain. So in terms of what I would have done differently, I think I would start with what might I have done differently before the pandemic occurred. And in that case, it really is focusing on those things that can have the most impact on the operations of the organisation. We were very fortunate at Centrica that we had done an exercise to look at single points of failure, and we had considered scenarios that could come together that would require an immediate response in our call centres, amongst our engineer workforce and so forth. And that exercise left us in a really good place. I think in other organisations I'm involved with, that exercise had not been completed as comprehensively. And I would really urge anybody to think through where those points of failure are and what you've learned about them in planning, so that you're able to be more resilient going forwards. I think within the context of the pandemic itself, the learning is to really think about the longer term and think about how do you need to reshape and restructure and support your teams and your people to be able to manage through a situation over not just the first few days, but the longer term also. It's perhaps easy to say now, looking back, that this was going to go on for a longer period of time. But I think in the first instance, we probably didn't acknowledge that the repercussions would be over the medium to longer term. And we focused on a very short term objective. So my key learning, I think, is to look at disruption in a longer term context and to really try to say, what do we need to do today to make the organisation as safe and secure as it can be? But how do we do that in a way that sets us up to grow and to develop out of the situation with a view to the longer term?